Right, so I'm taking a very deep breath, and maybe you behind your screen as well. And we're going to transition to another topic. We're going to transition from health to climate. And you may think, what is the link between mindfulness and climate change, climate action? But that's exactly the topic today. It's about understanding the linkage between the inner qualities that mindfulness can create and the activation of sustainable agency, sustainable action, I would say. And with us today, we have um, MEP Alviina Alametsä of the Greens. She is replacing Bas Eickhout, who unfortunately, due to other obligations and challenges right now, couldn't be here today. But she is very skillfully, I'm sure, replaced by Alviina Alametsä of the Greens of Finland. Right? She is a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and substitute member on several other committees. She is also 28, so I'm not sure if I was allowed to say that. She is certainly the youngest serving Finnish MEP. She has been member of the Helsinki City Council since 2017, and before becoming a member of the European Parliament, she also chairs its Equality Committee and was part of the board of the Helsinki Regional Transport Authority. So already a lot of relevant experience. Now, and Alviina will interview Jamie Bristow, who is just joined us here as well. Jamie is the director of the Mindfulness Initiative, which grew out of a program of mindfulness teaching for politicians in the British Parliament. The Mindfulness Initiative helped politicians to publish the influential Mindful Nation UK policy report. So a little bit like Sarah Sedash was just saying, immediately thinking through what systemic applications mindfulness could have. It's a very influential report, very interesting to read. And now Jamie works with politicians around the world to help them make mindfulness a serious consideration of public policy and has helped to introduce mindfulness training to over 10 national parliaments. He has a background in climate change campaign communications and advertising, which makes him a great guest for this part of the program. Now, I already talked a little bit about the topic of this particular session, so I'm going to hand it over immediately to Alviina. Thank you so much for joining, and it's you. You can take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaren, and thank you all. It is such a pleasure to be in this event with you. And I was actually very pleasantly surprised to be invited because Bas unfortunately couldn't be here, as I have been also working a bit in the mental health field before this position. And for me, I find all of these things quite connected, because if people are able to take better care of their mental health and find solutions for this, and if they are given the help and opportunities, I believe people will also have more resources to save the planet, help others, prevent conflict. And in this way, I think that what's going on in our mental health and our head will affect the whole society. And this is why I'm very honored to be interviewing Jamie here today a little bit. I have also used Headspace, which has been one of your major successes. And I am very excited to hear what you have on this topic. In Finland, I actually started my career in politics in climate activism. It was around 10 years ago. And right now, climate activism sometimes feels hopeless. But I have to admit that it felt a lot more hopeless 10 years ago when nobody was really talking about it. And at that point, I started thinking that at least mindfulness and mental health is a resource for those people who are battling in a difficult circumstance. People who are fighting against climate change, for example, in a world where nobody is not so interested about it yet. But for Mr. Bristow, Jamie, if I may, I would like to ask, how do you think that mindfulness could help us respond to the climate crisis? Here was my short thought on this, but how do you feel about the topic? And welcome.
Oh, thank you. Moi, Alviina. It's a real honor to be here today. So in order to explore the potential for mindfulness to help us to respond to the climate crisis, we first need to acknowledge the role of our inner worlds, which you've already done very beautifully there, because we have the technical solutions. We've had them for many years, sort of even largely 10 years ago, as you said. What's been holding us back is our mindset, our own internal capacities. We are the block, our psychology and our culture. And Al Gore is on record as having said that the more deeply he searches for the roots of the global environmental crisis, the more he is convinced that it is an outer manifestation of an inner crisis. It sounds like you agree with that Alviina, and you're not alone. And there's evidence that negotiators and other stakeholders who are involved in the international negotiations through the UN Climate Summit increasingly think that also. And they've really identified that it's mindsets and inner capacities which need to be developed. And there's some intuition, amongst organizers of these summits who invite faith leaders to come and talk about the sort of spiritual interior dimension of it, because I think a lot of the organizers recognize that piece seems to be missing from what can be quite technocratic. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is because we've for a long time considered mind and matter as separate categories, but now we increasingly know through medicine and other things that these are completely inseparable. So that our exterior world is shaped by the conditions and the qualities of our minds. And I'd like to focus on the most fundamental force, perhaps, shaping our society, and that's our mental model or paradigm. It's like a core analogy that we use to understand ourselves and the world. And so, for instance, are we as human beings rightfully at the kind of the top of a pyramid, dominating nature and other animals, or are we kind of in the middle of a web, a harmonic, interconnected web of life? Where any kind of action has a kind of knock-on effect across the entire web. These are images that are at the root of our culture and condition the choices we make and what our external world looks like. So the role of mindfulness is that in a really like non-trivial way, it sounds straightforward, but this is really kind of profound stuff. That mindfulness can help us to slow down, to tune into our bodies, to really connect with nature, and see and understand this interconnectivity in a different way, and therefore sort of shift our mindsets, these sort of mental models that are no longer serving us, or perhaps never did, and are now even killing us and other animals around the planet. So it helps us, to have a wiser understanding of the world in a mental model. In addition to that, it seems that mindfulness also leads to certain pro-environmental behaviors by improving some of the things that underpin those behaviors. So you mentioned already, Alviina, that mental health has an impact on pro-environmental behaviors. And yes, subjective well-being, mental health is one of those things. But there are also others like openness to new experiences and improvements in pro-sociality.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I find this very interesting. I was wondering then, when you think about the decision makers, for example, one thing that I have found through mindfulness and meditation has been that it helps you to decrease your ego. It makes you thinking about yourself a bit smaller and the thinking about universe a bit bigger. You put it a lot more beautifully about with the net and other things like this. But do you think that mindfulness would be beneficial for example, the decision makers also?
Yes, we've done some work. So I run a kind of a think tank, a policy institute about mindfulness, and we recently did a piece of work looking at how probably the most most important way to understand mindfulness and its benefits are that it underpins intentional action. So it helps us to perceive the world a bit more clearly and be receptive to a wider range of information. It helps us to make sense and make decisions a bit more clearly also, and then helps us to act together collectively in line with our deeper intentions and values. So these are skill sets for leaders, in these domains of perceiving things, understanding things, and acting with a bit more clarity and consciousness.
Yes, I think that's probably really true, and definitely climate change is one of these issues where we need to put other people before ourselves in a way also, especially when you look at the global exchange and how it goes. Here I am from Finland. We are really not doing so well about climate change, and we should be taking more of the burden, I see. And I think that the decision makers would really benefit from this kind of thinking. We know that we need to change our habits in this way, whether you are a decision maker or just an ordinary person, you're in your life, doing your thing. But how would you say that, how does mindfulness actually then help to make the change, or especially to relate to the climate crisis? How do you think that, how can we actually address the climate crisis through mindfulness?
Well, that's the big question we're here to explore today. So mindfulness, the clinical benefits of mindfulness that Anne's touched upon, most of them perhaps can be understood in terms of interrupting automatic behavior. So depression or preventing depression, where the evidence is strongest, is largely about interrupting sort of cycles of repetitive and negative thought that can drag us down into depressive relapse. And so, yeah, interrupting that automaticity is important. There's also evidence that it helps to interrupt automatic eating, interrupt automatic drinking behaviors, and other forms of addiction like smoking. And there's some evidence now that mindfulness helps us to interrupt automatic consumption habits more broadly. So there's an obvious link there, because a lot of our buying behavior is just blind habit and impulse. We do it because we've kind of always done it, or we want to distract ourselves from discomfort. So we just go and get something which distracts us and entertains us. So yeah, mindfulness will help by potentially interrupting that automaticity. It can also not just interrupt, but also develop new habits. So if we connect to our more intrinsic values, which mindfulness seems to do, and we want to, say, support communities and the health of the planet, or the ecosystem, we will be more likely to be able to establish those habits, because it works at a personal level, at least, being able to exercise better, and covered that a little bit there. There's also, there's a common misunderstanding about mindfulness as being only or largely about stopping or slowing down or being still. I've addressed how actually it helps us to act more clearly and consciously, but that being mode, the kind of the slowing down and allowing things to be as they are in the present moment, even whilst you're trying to moving through the world, is really important, because we through mindfulness practice we develop an ability to not strive for things to be different, whilst also acting to change things. And it sounds like a bit of a paradox, but bear with me. So by allowing things to be as they are, we can sort of step outside of the craving that we feel, and rather than blindly following them. So we might think more of the time, do I really need this? What am I really looking for in life? And that has a profound implication, as I say, for consumption. And then if I move on to the kind of more systemic picture, that's at the kind of individual level. We know we need to change, and how do we support ourselves to do that? There are practices we can do to help us. if we look at this more systemic level, like how does this relate to the big picture? Well, in an important way, the micro, the individual level, and the macro, the kind of planetary health, are mirrored with each other. They're interconnected, and so the well-being of the individual is a link to the well-being of the whole. So so researchers think that this connection between micro and macro, individual and planetary health is underpinned by subjective well-being, by physical health, and by behavior regulation. Because if we improve those things, then they tend to improve our human nature connection, and through that pro-environmental behaviors. So there's a kind of causal chain, and then from pro-environmental behaviors we have planetary health, and then also through this well-being and self-regulation, we also have a better connection to our intrinsic values, what's most important to us, like meaning and purpose. That tends to lead to greater care about others and better ability to relate to others. And then that in turn links to sort of social activism. So you can see that, you know, with these building blocks, we link these things which in the minds of policymakers have been quite separate. So the dominant sustainability approaches over 30 years have focused on these external things, economic incentives, government dynamics, and technology. But they've really missed this part of the picture. And it's also been assumed that human beings act in a kind of rational way. That, you know, we give people more information and they'll act on that. And like me 10 years ago, Alviina, in the climate movement, we were sort of just getting, we were just letting go of that idea that there was this sort of an information deficit, and we just give people more information and then everyone will change their behavior. But now we know that that doesn't happen, that we're not rational, and that mindfulness can further help us in two important ways. So firstly, we have confirmation bias, amongst other things. So we select information that supports our existing views, or we don't listen to information that challenges it. And here, this underlines that in order to change our existing views, people, it isn't enough to give people rational arguments. We need to counteract them, these deep-seated tendencies, through experience. So people need to actually sort of feel their way into seeing differently, rather than being sort of given information to see differently. And once again, mindfulness has a really important role to play here, because shifting mindsets, shifting views needs to engage both the head and the heart. It needs to be an emotional and an embodied, the change needs to be both emotional and embodied, not just intellectual. You need to get out of the head and into the felt sense. And so mindfulness helps individuals to come into contact with their experience and their emotions towards the natural world, and increase their sense of embeddedness, therefore getting around this sort of confirmation bias. And secondly, mindfulness helps us not to close down or panic in the face of difficult information. Because once people start to open up to and be sensitive to what's really going on in the world, the tendency can be to close straight down again, because it's somewhat scary stuff. So a core principle in mindfulness training is turning towards the difficult. Contrary to it being about like numbing or pacifying, we're actually intentionally opening to and examining what is most challenging. And this can potentially combat the bias and denial mechanisms that are getting in the way of action. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I find this really, really interesting. And when you think about it, actually, many forms of climate action and activism also have some connection to mindfulness exercise. If you think about, for example, climate marches, walking together, just walking for one cause and concentrating on this, or sitting outside of a school building on a school strike, not studying, not working because of climate change. I think I have personally felt some rather meditative moments also, sometimes in activism. And I find this really, really interesting. Do you have any further ideas then, Jamie? What should we do to make mindfulness more of a practice for everybody, and also to link the connection between mindfulness and climate change, these topics better? And what can we do as members of European Parliament and as politicians, because many are hearing from you today. So what ideas would you have for us?
Well, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to respond to that. But firstly, I just want to acknowledge that whatever you think of the strategies or tactics of the Extinction Rebellion protest movement, they have used mindfulness and other kind of contemplative approaches to ground their work. So there's a really interesting connection there between the potential to resource and sort of self-regulate and sort of have that kind of clear action in activism. Well, firstly, mindfulness training always involves some element of actually the practice, the training of the mind, familiarizing ourselves with this natural human capacity of mindfulness, and then combining that with some kind of psychoeducation, sort of psychological training. And that psychoeducation can be geared towards depression or health outcomes, or it could be geared towards more climate outcomes or social outcomes. So there's a real potential to integrate mindfulness training with complexity and systems thinking, or organizational change theory, or bias and decision-making training, to really for leaders or other walks of life. And that's and there's some really good examples of that already happening. There's one in the Welsh government. Civil servants have a bias awareness and decision-making mindfulness course, which has some really promising results. So I'd say for MEPs, however, I have sort of three recommendations, and that is, I think we need to mainstream this principle of inside-out sustainability thinking throughout all of sustainability policy making, and not make it a kind of a side thing or an add-on. And that means potentially having some kind of unit or directorate responsible for doing that. I think we need to invest in the inner lives of citizens and leaders. So there's a need for governments, institutions, and educational bodies in order to underpin climate action, but also just more generally, we need to grow up as a human species, and that involves investing in our inner life. And finally, I'd say that there needs to be more research. Like a lot of the stuff I've mentioned here very briefly is sort of early, small studies, and we need proper investment. Ideally, we need a sort of a 10 million euro program, particularly looking at mindfulness and climate programs that would make a really big difference. You can, my organization, in collaboration with Lund University and Professor Christine Walmsler there in Sweden, Wamsler, are looking at more recommendations and more detail. And we're going to be publishing a report on this in April or May next year. So if you'd like some more details, follow up with me. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Alviina.
so
Any
much.
final words?
For me, at least, I learned a lot from the topic, and I believe there might be some questions also in the questions box, but perhaps the moderator will share those. This was insightful, and I definitely think that, at least for me personally, mindfulness has been a key ingredient in my life, and it has been something that has helped me to go further with activism, even in times with no hope, or when I have felt hopeless. And it is also something that I daily use in my work as a parliamentarian. And I know it's a difficult challenge to bring it to everybody, but I believe that everybody would benefit. And this is something that we heard also from Jamie, from numerous evidence that he had. So thank you so much. And for me also happy to continue with the discussions also later on. And I'm really interested personally in mental health, climate, and how to combine these. And I think that there is also the solution and the key to our emerging problems such as climate change. So this is something I think we definitely agree on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alviina. This is really rich. Thank you for sharing your personal experience as well. I think that will really resonate with a lot of people here. And by setting this example as a political leader, I think you are making a change in the moment here. So thank you so much. Extremely helpful. Thank you, Jamie, as well. We will both hopefully see you back if you can stay a little bit longer for the Q&A. I know there are questions coming in. I see them coming in. It's a wonderful subject and not so well known, this linkage between the inner elements and the outer elements, the action of climate action. So really very pleased to have had the space here in the European Parliament. So thank you.